The Y Curve with Phil Dobby and Roger Hearing.
Should we have a right to protest?
Of course, in a democracy, every citizen can disagree with the government and make their disagreement clear in public.
But if that involves blocking the M25, or people gluing themselves to the roof of a commuter train, or dumping yellow powder all over the table at the World Snooker Championships...
But protest has got to be noticed in order to be worthwhile. If there's no disruption, it has no effect.
And what about the big state occasion, the coronation, where the police heavy-handed when they detained anti-monarchy protesters, or were they justifiably using new laws to prevent them ruining what most people were enjoying?
Because there are new laws, very new laws, and no one quite knows how they work yet.
So, what should be allowed when it comes to protest? Are we gradually losing the right to demonstrate dissent?
That's our subject today on The Y Curve.
Brought to you by Wigmore Associates.
The Y Curve.
So, you know what, I love generally the way people protest in Britain, because we do it in largely, or historically have, with a few exceptions like the poll tax riots, for example, but generally dissent has been fairly good-humoured, hasn't it?
Yes.
You know, people holding those placards going, down with this sort of thing.
We're not French, is what you're saying.
Yeah, well,
we don't tend... No, I mean, there have been exceptions in the poll tax riots, for example. Certainly those things exist. But no, you're right. It has been generally that way. But what we've moved to, I think, reasonably... Well, I mean, the suffragettes were busy running under horses and chaining themselves to things and that kind of stuff. But recently there's been a move with, particularly, I guess, environmental protesters, disrupting things. And people get very cross. You know, they block the road. They stop people getting to hospitals. They stop people working.
Yeah.
So the question is that acceptable or not?
Well, yeah. I mean, halting people getting to work, the average speed of the M25 is about 25 miles an hour now.
Yes, well, that's true.
And then halting public transport, 1 in 5 people reported that their travel plans would have been disrupted by rail strikes. And 1 in 10 unable to get to work because of rail strikes.
That's another form of protest in a way, I suppose.
Well, I guess it is, sort of.
But no, I mean, there is an issue there, because, should a minority, and they are a minority of people, be allowed to disrupt our daily lives?
Yeah. But my point is that it's getting disrupted anyway, in an environment where very often people are protesting about exactly the same thing, like with the rail strikes. You're stopping ambulances getting to hospitals. I mean, that's a good one. We hear that used a lot in the mainstream media as a reason against protests. And yet at the same time, we've got ambulances queuing outside hospitals.
And they're not even doctors to treat people when they get there.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's true. But there is an issue about, what actually, apart from, the difficulties of the actual infrastructure itself, the fact is that perhaps people make things worse by blocking the M25 or other things of that nature. But is it valid? Is it right? Should it be allowed for people to do that if it damages so many other people's lives?
Well, I mean, you gave the example of the suffragettes, and you have to be noticed to drive change, and you have to question if you can't disrupt people's lives. What do you do? Write to your local MP. My local MP is Jeremy Hunt. If I write a letter to Jeremy Hunt saying, "Hey, Jeremy, a little bit concerned that we're not doing enough about the environment. Could you fix it for us?" What do you think Jeremy Hunt's going to say?
But you see, once every 5 years, you have the option to vote him out, in theory. I mean, we are a democracy once every 5 years, probably. And the idea is that is the point of control and protest and everything else.
Yeah.
And historically, it has to be said, people who've waging campaigns do get onto MPs, they do push their cause, and it can affect change. Look for everything through the abortion law, the late 60s, the repeal of anti-gay laws, all kinds of things.
Now, all of that would be perfect if the ability to communicate ideas and public discourse was open and uncontrolled. But if you look at the media in this country, the print media, 60% is owned by 2 families. Which have a bit of a right-wing bent. So that idea that these things can be discussed in public in an open forum through established channels doesn't apply. So you have to do something that is going to cut across the...
Yeah, but there are other options. I mean, nobody under 20, nobody under 30 reads a newspaper these days. People express themselves on social media, and that's open. You can put anything you want out there. So that's always available. And you can always also vote with your money. If you have money, you move money. You don't invest in things that you don't approve of. So that's another form of protest.
Well, yeah. Now, talking about money...
Ah, yes. Funny you should mention that. Let's talk about Wigmore Associates, because they provide wealth management services to individuals and trusts, covering everything from pensions, tax, planning, and inheritance tax advice. These days, the regulatory landscape is complex as ever. There are over 2,400 pages of legislation that amounts to the UK tax code. It's a full-time job keeping across it, and that's why you need to put it in the hands of experts. Wigmore Associates is a boutique asset management firm based in London who have, over the years, built long-standing relationships with clients based on understanding, trust, and a commitment to excellence. And part of their commitment to excellence, of course, is backing this podcast.
And we thank them for it. So have you ever been on a protest?
I've been involved in a riot, but that was abroad, and not one I was involved in. I was involved in reporting it.
So I went to the protest. Well, it wasn't really a protest; it was just a gathering of people. But I think there was supposedly close to 1 million when we were protesting against Brexit. And it was largely good-natured. And what I loved was the banners that were up there. And, you think of the idea of a British protester. It is somebody, so like a family out with a picnic basket with a banner that says down with this sort of thing.
Yes, pushing the pram.
And I see that one of the anti-monarchy protesters had down with this sort of king. Which
you have to admire that.
Which I thought was quite good.
But the thing is with all that, as you said...
Another one, by the way, was someone saying, don't you think this is all a bit silly?
But if people don't feel listened to, then they inevitably, I guess, go to other measures, and that's a big problem. Anyway, let's talk to someone who knows all about the way protest is handled, should be handled, the way the law is, what the law should say, where human rights come in, all that, and that's David Mead, who's Professor of Human Rights Law at the University of East Anglia. Now, he specialises in the law and practice of public order, peaceful protest and political dissent, and he's advised governments. Let's bring him in and get a sense of what this is all about.
So, David, what exactly, this new bill, is it needed? What's it providing that wasn't covered by existing legislation, like the Public Order Act, for example?
Well, that's a very good question, because I think a lot of what's in it, maybe I should sort of run through what's in it. So there's sort of three things that we could group them into. So there's a series of new offences. The one which hit the news at the weekend was a new offence of locking on. So there's a group of about 4 or 5 different offences with as is usual, different police powers of arrest.
We should just explain that locking on is when you attach yourself to something as part of a protest.
Well, it is, and we can sort of explore that a bit later if you like. But so it's a very, very loose definition, and so perhaps sort of getting ahead of myself, then to come back. It can be as loose as locking arms to another person. So it doesn't require you to have any equipment. There is an offence of having equipment to be locked on, but the offence of locking on. So there are 2 separate offences: locking yourself on and having equipment to lock yourself on with.
Right. So how does that apply if you're locking arms? So you could be arrested for having arms.
Yes. Well, that's a very excellent... I've not thought of exactly... One of the things that I have written about quite a lot is that you could be in trouble potentially if you're wearing lace-up shoes rather than slip-ons, because you can obviously attach yourself with laces. So it doesn't require any specific equipment. So the police have been... and indeed the government perhaps have been focusing on people who lock themselves on with bike locks or even something more permanent. So a lot of activist tactics over the years has been effectively to concrete yourself to someone else in a tube and leaving the police to have to get you out of that with a lot of equipment, time, labour resources, etc. We can debate whether or not people should.
Well, let's just get through what the other things are in the law, and then obviously we can chew into it.
So there's a raft of offences, including tunnelling. Then there is a separate set of powers about stop and search powers, both with reasonable suspicion and indeed where the police do not need to have any reasonable suspicion of you. And then the third area where this new act has changed the law is it's brought in something called serious disruption prevention orders, which are a form of civil injunction that can be granted if you've committed a single protest crime in the past within the last 5 years, and then you can have an injunction or an order served upon you that if you recommit it, you don't even need to go. You're effectively in breach of a court order, and you're going to go almost certainly straight to prison without needing to be prosecuted for that new offence. So those are the 3 areas: a set of offences with arrest powers, stop and search powers, both with and without reasonable suspicion, and then these new SDPO, serious disruption prevention.
So
orders.
how much of that could have been covered by previous legislation?
Certainly the offences, most of them could be. So it's already and has long been an offence to obstruct the highway. So in the same way as if I double park my car, I'm obstructing the highway without lawful excuse. Obstruction of the highway has been used quite a lot to arrest and charge and prosecute protesters over the last decade or so. Locking on has not been a specific crime, but it's long been a crime to trespass on someone else's property and obstruct their lawful activities. So there have been cases where people have been arrested for that. It's called aggravated trespass, came in 1994, and people have been arrested for what now would be locking on, but was once aggravated trespass. And it's also been an offence to commit to tunnel for the same crime as well. It's an aggravated. People have been charged and arrested and prosecuted for aggravated trespass for tunnelling under the HS2 site, within the last year or so. So a lot of what is in the Act could probably have been covered by specific pre-existing public order offences. So we do have to wonder what it's there for.
Yeah, well, yeah, exactly. And also, why so specific? It's almost like, well, these are things happening lately. And, the skeptic might say, well, hang on, what you're doing is you're picking things which are in the news, techniques which are being deployed lately, and you're building legislation to stop that.
Or just responding to the ways in which protesters are moving.
But I mean, because it's so specific, it's like if you create a law which is that specific, then people will say, well, okay, we won't do that. We'll do something else. Which is not included in this law, which could cause the same amount of disruption. But the fact that you haven't mentioned it means it's clearly not as much of a problem as far as you're concerned. I could stop printing of the Sun newspaper, for example. Which
let's not go there.
People might actually see as being a benefit to society, but I mean it's against the law. So why not use that as an example of an infrastructure that you could be protesting against and blocking?
Well, there is now specific sort of part of the serious disruption. I mean, it's interesting you should take that as an example, because one of the definitions of serious disruption, which now sort of pervades the whole of this new legislation, includes, I don't have it right to hand, but includes basically includes the newspaper industry. So it's listed as one of the separate freestanding things. But I think the more general point is either these are history is full of knee-jerk reactions to specific problems which are then either evaded very easily, so you just spend your legislative time responding to the next thing 6 months later, or in order to stop that following of the activist path, you draft it so widely that it captures an awful lot of stuff. I mean, that's the problem of the arrests at the weekend. So to go back to locking on, you're right that the problem identified, and we can argue whether or not people should be able to lock themselves in concrete, in shops or whatever, and for hours and hours. But in order to deal with that perceived problem, the legislation has been drafted without any qualifier of for a reasonable length of time or non-transient or whatever. I mean, literally, under the legislation, if the three of us were to get cross about something and decide to link arms, even momentarily, we have, on the face of the legislation, committed a crime.
So this is really very draconian in comparison to where we were before.
It has that risk. I mean, perhaps I could be a bit more cautious than perhaps I usually am, but the problem is the creation of offences to deal with specifics that are then evaded or have the capacity to be misused or just misunderstood. And I mean, this is my fear of policing. And largely the police haven't wanted many of these new offences. There's a real fear amongst certainly amongst former officers. I think current officers, very difficult to know their views because obviously there are professional duties upon them, etc. And their job is just impartially to apply the law. And for them to question whether or not law X is a good law becomes problematic for a whole host of different reasons. But senior officers, so Peter Farkey was the Chief Constable of Greater Manchester, and Owen West, who I think was a Chief Super in West Yorkshire and Public Order Commander, have both gone on the record very repeatedly over the last half a year to a year, really worried about this legislation. For the problems it is going to brew up for the police, for legitimacy, for asking to hold the ring, and all of those sorts of things that we can just see happened over the weekend with the coronation.
But it's going to be tested in court, isn't it? I mean, when they had the arrests, the judges, in effect, are going to make the law in a way. They're going to interpret it in a way that the police
doesn't
will be
even
guided
get
by.
that far, because so many people, of course, it's last weekend we're talking about, so many people arrested were let go without charge. So, I mean, that's not a good first outing, is it?
This is sort of one of the things I've been writing about over the last 20 years or so, of my area of interest has been the problem of public order law is not so much or not always what does the law say, but how is it applied? How do people understand it might apply? So your point just then, I mean, it really is bang on. It's most of these cases won't go to court. Most cases, people are arrested and then released without charge, X hours after. Now, they might then still bring, and I think Graham Smith is going to bring a wrongful arrest.
Yeah, Graham Smith is the leader of the Republic, exactly, and one of the most prominent arrested people.
Over the weekend, yeah, exactly right, yeah. So I can't imagine that he's not going to pursue this. So there could be some court cases, but by and large, people are dealt with in one of two ways. They either never get through the criminal justice process because they never go on a protest because they're worried that something bad might happen, or they go on a protest, they're arrested, taken out of the scene, and released a few hours later. But the chance of them
without a charge.
For
the police, the job is done because they were taken away and couldn't protest.
So they didn't protest. So the right to protest has been taken away from people.
Yes. It has. It's not been taken away so much by or exclusively by the law of locking on or whatever it is. It's been taken away by perceptions and misunderstandings and a discretionary power that the police have that is just not hedged with enough safeguard. It's just no use a few months later. I mean, even for Graham Smith, to be able to go to court and get X £1,000 worth in. I mean, the Met will undoubtedly settle this. I can't see them fighting this, but they may. He's lost his chance to go boo hiss to the king. Now we can have a debate about whether or not he should be able to go boo hiss to the king on the day of the coronation, but that sort of isn't the point. I mean, in a free democracy, we should be able to go boo hiss to anyone that we like, and not.
Yeah, I mean that isn't open to debate, is it? I mean, he absolutely has the right. Surely,
well, the police in the Met statement they said that, but. And they said it was unfortunate that he was arrested, but it does take away from the fact that he wasn't able to protest.
Unfortunate but convenient. But this idea that you can stop and search protesters. So if I turned up at a protest and I'm looking like a little bit unwashed, my shirt's not been ironed properly, and I've got there on my bike and I've got my bike lock in my hand, I can be arrested for what I'm going to do with that bike lock, and
what you might do.
What I might do. It's all a bit Minority Report, isn't it?
Well, it is. I mean, in some ways, this goes to a much bigger problem of policing, and not just policing in the UK, but so much police power is predicated not on things having happened, but on reasonable belief or reasonable suspicion that something might happen. And it's very difficult. And of course, if we were to require the police only ever to act once a bad thing has happened, then bad things happen. And we would be crying much more or as much, if a bad thing happened to us, and we said, but why didn't you do something to stop me being bashed in the nose? Well, I can't do anything to stop you being bashed in the nose until you're bashed in the nose. I mean, you can see how it works, but it's how do you hedge that preventative, preemptive discretion?
Yeah. Which is the bigger societal question, isn't it? What do we think we should allow? I mean, would it have been all right, I don't know, if some eggs had been thrown at the royal carriage during the coronation? Would it have been okay? Would we have accepted that? or if people had somehow, I don't know, chained themselves to one of the guardsmen. I mean, all manner of things could have happened, and there would have been howls of outrage about that because it was a big public occasion where the majority of people wanted it to go well. Yeah. Should a minority be able to disrupt that?
Or should the police be there at the supermarkets looking at who's buying eggs and arresting them for it?
Well, exactly. But that pays into what we think should be acceptable protest. Is it clear in Britain what is acceptable protest?
I would say it isn't.
Well, it isn't part of it what public perception is. So, I mean, I wonder whether, some of these protesters have clearly gone too far and they're not helping their case. I think most people would say that. So,
but they still have the right to.
They have the right to, but they will find that if it's not working for them, maybe they'll pull back. I mean, I do feel as though there's very little in the way that you can publicly demonstrate. So, climate change is an interesting example, isn't it? Because how do you protest about something which has got such a long shelf life to it, and get your voice heard? And is
it because things have changed, David? Would it be true to say that the perception of what is acceptable in terms of protest has changed?
Do you know? I'll be honest. I don't know the answer. I mean, in terms of sort of research, etc. I don't know the answer to that. So I sort of speaking slightly off the cuff and slightly, off guarded. I think the difficulty we've always had, and I've sort of talked about this a long time ago, it's a bit like NIMBYism. We generally are tolerant of people's right to protest until it affects. I sort of put NIMBYism with a silent P, sort of protest, but not in my backyard, a bit like pneumatic. So we generally are accepting of and supporting of it in the abstract. But we get very cross when we can't go to the shops because someone has sat down in the zebra crossing in front of Tesco or Sainsbury's or something like that. And I think that's the sort of the disjuncture that we perhaps as a public need to try and reconcile or have people help us reconcile is the value of protest as a social good, if you like. The fact that I don't agree with it, this comes back to Rousseau and all of those sorts of things. But the fact that I don't agree with it and perhaps vehemently oppose it should not ever be a reason for somebody's rights to be taken away. And I think it becomes very difficult when we are the immediate, if you like, target or incident of the target, for us to sort of disjoin ourselves from the generally perceived view that protest is a good thing in a democracy.
Well, look,
whether or not people's tactics work, and again, this is sort of off my area, is a different question to what should the law, whether this ultimately will backfire for Just Stop Oil, and XR, I don't know, but the law needs to respond differently to how it's responding at the moment, I think.
So, look, if a group of protesters had stood at the end of our street and blocked the road for 4 months, sort of like a major road into our town for 4 months, we might have something to say about it. But South East Water can do that and close the road up for 4 months.
What Phil is expressing is sort of very local anger, which he's mentioned on a couple of other occasions as well. But I suppose the point is that, yes, obviously disruption can be caused in lots of places by lots of people for different reasons.
But as to attitude, so I have got some numbers here because there was a fact sheet on the Public Order Bill, which was published late last month by the government, and they quote a YouGov poll saying 63% of the public support making locking on a criminal offence. So I thought that's interesting. So they provided a link to the YouGov report, and one of the questions was, in fact, the first question, in general, do you think policing of public demonstrations in the UK is too strict, not strict enough, or about right? And only a third said it wasn't strict enough. 2/3, the more than that, actually said it was about right or didn't know. So actually a minority of the population in a report that they conveniently link to when trying to make the case, the opposite case. And it is older Conservative voters that are,
But also maybe to Dave's point, it's the NIMBYism, because the large majority perhaps have never actually been affected particularly by a protest, haven't been inconvenienced. But obviously the people who have, I guess, are angry about
obviously they are older Conservative constituents who have been impacted. That's why they're so angry about it.
Yeah, very likely.
Making a law for the next generation.
It's interesting. I just, as you were speaking, I remembered I'd read something in the context of something else I was talking about a few weeks ago. There was a poll by Omnisis that the Guardian reported last October, and I haven't got the wording, so apologies, but the sort of the headline figure in the Guardian was 66% support non-violent direct action to protect the UK's natural environment. I mean, that's not quite the same as climate change, of which 44% of Tories did so. So I think there is a sort of a swell of realising, to take climate change as that one example. And I think there are issues around what other things might be caught by that we are facing, such a sort of a seismic event that something needs to give, and people are accepting of the highlight. And I think that, and I agree, 4 months at the end of the road, but a lot of the disruption is minor level, relative to most other things. And as you said just now, and I just sort of did some scribbles, and this is a point I always make, I live very close to Norwich City's football ground, and on a Saturday afternoon, we don't balk, or nobody seems to balk, at the fans streaming along the road after the match, making their way home. We don't really balk at big crowds of people on shopping streets at the start of the January, this dates me, at the start of the January sales. But we do seem to balk at disruption that has an even more obviously sort of politically
it's
expressive purpose.
So massive disruption from those Norwich games, isn't there? So if you're there wearing a scarf with the Norwich colours, you should be arrested for the intent for causing disruption.
So we're getting some more personal stuff coming through.
Well, I'm not a Norwich fan, so I have no views on Norwich whatsoever.
But I suppose that the central core in this is, does protest have to be disruptive? I mean, you can stand, I don't know, in some roped-off area where the police say, fine, stand there. You can even have an organised march into Parliament Square, over Westminster Bridge, agree it with the police, no one objects. Why should protest have to actually be disruptive?
I think it has to be disruptive because it has to jolt us. It has to make us confront things that we wouldn't otherwise confront. And I think there is obviously a place for large scale staged marches and assemblies. They have a very useful purpose for the participants and things like that. But I think there is also a really important role for disruption of us. So I don't necessarily mean disruption of traffic, but I sort of tend sometimes to equate the word disruption with jolting. We need to be jolted, to have to confront things full on, that a large number of people walking down the street with banners just doesn't require us to do.
But how far can the disruption? I mean, you say about disruption is necessary, or jolt, if you like. But look at what's been happening in France in the process there, where petrol bombs, hurled paving stones, and tear gas are all part of the furniture of what they would see as protest. Not the same here. Normally, we would call that a riot.
Right, not condoning it, but they are getting their message across.
Yeah, they're definitely making a jolt, aren't they?
Yeah. This is sort of how long is a piece of string.
But if the law is there saying, you can't jolt too much, then you are effectively removing that right to effectively. You're saying you can protest so long as it's not effective protest.
Yes.
Well, there's both effective process and there is sort of, without sort of getting too highfalutin about it, protests within a sort of a scheme managed by the state, and almost what you are trying to do, having a protest generally is confront power. And the last thing that you perhaps should be doing as a protester is being co-opted into those sort of same structures and mechanisms. You need to take it on at a sort of an institutional level, as well as at a sort of a more physical level of sitting in the road and disrupting cars, etc. There's an important point that they have to be confrontational. I mean, on the basis, I think that many protests, again, if we take climate change, as an example, we're here where we are precisely because everyone has been all nicely about it. And we're not going, I'm not speaking for myself. I'm sort of, I suppose, to some extent putting the words in the mouths of others. We're not going to solve this by all nicely sitting around the table. The table, the matter is now too pressing, and we haven't done that previously. We've got to do something that is more critical, as a response. Now, I think there are then interesting questions about how far, climate change as a thing also licenses other forms of obviously very disruptive protests. I think protests. And so, there is a discussion to be had that if we do accept that climate is an exception to our normal rules of how we go about making political points, and again, we debate, that's a debate to be had. How far does that also license other same forms of protest about other matters that might be less pressing, less urgent, etc.? Because there is a real risk, and this sort of slightly gainsays the point I've just made. That within a democracy there are channels for having resolution of contentious matters.
We call it elections. Writing your MP.
Exactly. So sort of elections about the allocation of the state's scarce resources. And once you opt out of that, we are as a society in perhaps an even more difficult position. And I mean, I've started to try and think about this, but my area is the law, is not political science and theory. But I think that is a debate that really needs to be had as well, because voting once every 5 years, particularly under our electoral system, as you and the listeners will know, that almost certainly produces minority support governments with majorities in parliament, is really not a solution to our problems. If you can get 43% of the popular vote but have 60%, 55-60% of the seats in parliament, something's gone wrong somewhere.
Yeah, and then you've got this action, which is what people seem to revert to in frustration. And I mean, we've talked about France, but what about the United States and January the 6th? That was clearly channeling anger with very bad consequences. It's still, what you might call the propaganda of the deed. It got it into what people were talking about.
Well, there is the difference, isn't there, between what is a protest where you're trying to make a point, and it's orchestrated to try and get as much exposure to that point, versus just out and out anger, which is not a protest. It becomes a riot.
Howl of rage.
Yeah. So and there might be a justified reason behind a riot, but that is a different situation. I'm not quite sure how you delineate, but obviously, if people are rioting just through anger and burning shops and
throwing things at the police,
then that you need the heavy hand of the law to come down on that.
We've walked into a different territory, haven't we? I mean, I don't think we're helped in this country, by the political discourse around protest and activism, which is. There will obviously be divides, but the divide between what, in shorthand, we might call good protesters and bad protesters, everyday people going about their hard-working business and everyone else is a baddie, is not going to serve us well in the long term. The line between acceptability and a sort of illegitimacy has been struck in so bad, so much the wrong place, by the current and previous Home Secretaries pushing this legislation through.
You've spoken a lot, obviously, about what is wrong with the current laws, including the latest ones. What, in your opinion, would be the way then? Because it's easy, I suppose, to pick holes in this, and I can imagine people shouting at the devices right now, saying, "Come on, what is actually the way to do it?" Because is it just open season? We let anything happen? What would be a good, logical, human rights based way of dealing with it?
I think we have to cite the line of disruption in a different place. I mean, there is very strong human rights case law. Again, I mean, obviously there is a debate about how far, not a view that I subscribe to, that we should be bound by European convention case law, but we are at the moment, and there is very strong case law that levels of disruption are both to be tolerated and acceptable within a democratic society. The difficulty, and this is really the $64 million question, and I don't have an answer to it, but sort of just raising it perhaps just might highlight the problem, is sort of, it's a two-side of the same coin. It's who is making the decisions about what is and isn't acceptable, and what remedies and powers do people have when those decisions, have been taken? Because it becomes an impossible thing really to police, because we can't have politicians doing it. If we give it to the police, we are in problems, and they're in a position they don't want to be in. They don't want to be trying to hold the line between opposing factions. And I think there is and linked to that is when the police use these powers, which, as I say, are predominantly preemptive, predictive powers of what will happen, the remedies that people have are very, very few and far between. So I think one of the things that we need to think very seriously about is how can we ensure that so the first thing is that we hedge policing discretion and constrain it much more. We don't draft very vague legislation as we have with holding on. We limit so far as possible powers that are based upon prediction and prevention. And when we do things like that, we ensure that there are avenues, both in advance for people so far as we can to challenge, and speedy accountability, etc. afterwards. But the history has just been simply just a repeat of policing year on year on.
So maybe a kind of commissioner or an ombudsman or an off-prot or something that would actually decide what's acceptable, or you could appeal to.
I think something like that. This perhaps sort of takes us a bit left field, but bear with me. When we have privacy cases, in other words, if I'm a journalist about to publish a story about a public figure, I can, and I'm the public figure, and I've got wind of this, I can go to a judge throughout the night. There's a judge on call, on duty, to grant an injunction at 4 a.m. And that's because we value privacy and that battle with the free speech of the press. And it seems to me that if we value protest as a socially beneficial thing generally, we need to have some sort of mechanism where we can ensure that the enforcement of the right is given effect to at a time when people need it. Now, quite how we would do that, I honestly don't, because much of policing is taking place on the scene, on the day. But we need at least to think about and move towards a system where people whose rights are going to be reduced by a policing decision in advance or at the time don't have to wait 3 months for a judge to say, yes, that was bad, that shouldn't have happened to you, but you've lost the chance to go boo hiss to the king. I mean, that's a bad place for democracy to be in.
So that free press you're talking about, I mean, 60% of it is owned by the Harmsworth family and the Murdoch family. So, yeah. and that is part of the problem, isn't it? It's that voice. It's people feeling as though they've got an issue that they want to raise the profile of. How do they do that? So they protest. I mean, I just wonder whether, I don't think we're going to answer it now because it's a problem that's been going on for generations, but how do you provide that voice? Because actually, I mean, I'm sure most of these people involved in the protest would like to get onto the next level, which is, now I've raised the profile of this, what are we going to do about it? And let's get some public discourse going on.
Yes, I think that's exactly, and that avenue is, as you say, is to a large degree foreclosed unless you agree with Harmsworth, etc. You're not going to get your message on the front page of the Daily Mail or the Sun or anything like that, are you? Generally speaking,
no.
It's very, very
voice for the voiceless, which is what I guess protest has always been down the ages anyway.
I think that's exactly it. I mean, I suppose one of the advantages of the last few years of technological developments, and there's a lot of stuff written about this, is this sort of emancipatory power, the sort of democratizing power of the internet and the web and things like that. But
you say that until Twitter was bought, of course. I mean,
well, I think there's a whole, there's sort of the amplification of it goes back to my point about needing to be confronted and jolted. There's a lot of literature that all we really read on social media is amplification of our own views. We're not challenged by that chance meeting of a load of people just round the street corner with a load of placards or something and go, God, yeah, I'd never thought about that. That is a bad thing. I'll check it. We don't get that on social media, or generally we just don't get that. We're not forced into those sorts of things.
So we need that jolt that someone putting yellow powder on the table at the snooker achieves, maybe. And there are obviously very different views about whether that was a good thing tactically, but it made the point. I mean, take the Van Goghs as well, with Just Stop Point. They have got something onto an agenda
Now, many would say it was already there, but I do question that, and I think we always need to have these sort of reminders, and we're just inured largely to 100,000 people walking down the street with placards. So it doesn't make the news. Whether perhaps if it did, people would feel less inclined to take Van Gogh on and to take the snooker on. But the reality is that lots of people walking down a street just isn't newsworthy.
Yeah. No. Look, I mean, if you're trying to raise the profile, actually interrupting a snooker match, I'm surprised that got any coverage. I mean, if you knew that there was going to be someone protesting in snooker, might be more people watching snooker, perhaps.
Maybe they should interrupt Antiques Roadshow instead.
Yeah. And it didn't get quite why a yellow powder. I guess it's because you couldn't see the ball because it was covered in yellow powder. I don't know.
Well, an interesting way of playing the game. David, I think we've certainly got to an interesting stage this, and I'm certainly going to think about that idea of some sort of way of, having an ombudsman or somebody in there to kind of sort this out before...
Who appoints the ombudsman?
Well, Custodes as ever, but thank you.
Exactly right. Yeah.
Thank you very much for being with us on that. Really interesting and a lot to think about, so thank you.
Thanks, David.
Thank you very much indeed. Cheers.
Take care.
Of course, one of the people who got caught up in all of those protests on the Coronation Day was an Aussie, Alice Chambers, a 36-year-old who was an architect who was a bit of a royalist.
Big royal fan.
She was there to support it all, and she got arrested because she was standing in
the wrong people, you see.
Yeah.
No, you see, the police are always right on these things.
Well, it just shows how wrong it's gone, isn't it? Anyway, look, that's one of the problems we face in society. Another big problem is if you're young and you want to have a house, which, we've all sort of, it's a great promise, isn't it? It's a big dream.
Massive problem, of course, and with the rise in interest rates, mortgages become more difficult. Generation rent, of course, young people also failing even to be able to rent and living at home well into their 20s, even 30s, living with their parents still. There's all this out there, and difficulties of how to resolve it.
Yeah, and supply and demand is part of it, isn't it? But it's also just around the world. You look and you see, as the rich get richer, asset prices go up in value, and houses are obviously the one asset that everyone wants to cling on to. And we're in that situation now where, you can't afford a house unless your parents had one and they've handed down a bunch of money. So there's an intergenerational wealth thing.
Yeah, and even rent goes through the roof. I mean, there's lots of horror stories about that. So very difficult times. We're going to be talking about how to resolve, if possible,
housing affordability. Yeah.
And that's coming up next on
The Y Curve, brought to you by Wigmore Associates. We'll catch you next week. Thanks for listening.
The Y Curve.